What if before modern humans there was a war, not between nations, but between species? What if 280,000 years ago our world was shared by more than one kind of human, and their struggle for survival decided the fate of everything that came after? Close your eyes and imagine a world you've never seen but somehow remember. A world where the sun rises over landscapes untouched by cities, where forests stretch endlessly beneath skies unmarked by contrails, where the only lights at night are stars and distant fires flickering in caves. This is Earth, 280,000 years ago. But this Earth is not empty. It is not waiting for humanity to arrive. Humanity is already here, walking, thinking, dreaming, surviving. Only it isn't just one humanity, it's many. In the valleys of Africa, along the coasts of Asia, through the forests of Europe, different kinds of humans move through their days. They hunt, they gather, they make tools with hands that know the weight of stone. They speak in languages we will never hear. They look up at the same moon we see tonight, and perhaps they wonder, as we do, what lies beyond the horizon. But they are not us. Not yet. They are something older, something parallel, something that existed in a time when being human meant something far more diverse than we ever imagined. This is the story of that time, a time before history, before writing, before the great civilizations that would one day claim the earth as theirs alone. This is the story of when humanity was not singular, but plural. When the question wasn't whether humans would survive, but which humans would survive. And in that question lies a mystery that has haunted our species ever since. A mystery written in bones buried deep in the ground, in fragments of DNA coiled within our cells, in myths whispered around fires for thousands of generations. What happened when these different humans met? Did they recognize each other as kin, or did they see only strangers? Did they trade and interbreed, or did they fight and flee? And why, in the end, did only one kind of human remain to inherit the earth? The answers lie buried in time, waiting to be uncovered. And the deeper we dig, the stranger the story becomes. The world, 280,000 years ago, was a place of extremes. Ice sheets crept down from the poles, then retreated, then advanced again in cycles that lasted tens of thousands of years. Coastlines shifted. Forests became grasslands, rivers changed their courses. The climate was unstable, unpredictable, demanding constant adaptation from every living thing. And in this crucible of change, multiple species of humans had carved out their existence. In Africa, the cradle of our kind, early Homo sapiens were beginning to emerge. They were not yet the humans we would recognize today. Their skulls were slightly different, their tools more primitive, their societies smaller and more scattered. But they possessed something remarkable, a flexibility of thought, an ability to adapt and innovate that would eventually set them apart from all others. They lived in small bands, moving with the seasons, following herds of antelope and zebra across the savannas. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill. They painted their bodies with ochre, perhaps the first stirrings of symbolic thought, the first whispers of art and ritual. But Africa was vast, and Homo sapiens were not alone there. Homo heidelbergensis, an older species, still walked the continent. They were robust, powerful, with brains nearly as large as ours. They had mastered fire long ago, used sophisticated hunting techniques, and may have possessed some form of language. They had survived for hundreds of thousands of years, spreading from Africa into Europe and Asia. They were successful, established, dominant, and yet something was changing. The world was shifting beneath their feet, and new competitors were rising. Far to the north, in the cold valleys of Europe, the Neanderthals were thriving. They had evolved in isolation, adapting to the harsh Ice Age conditions with stocky, muscular bodies built to conserve heat. Their brains were actually larger than those of modern humans, though shaped differently. They were not the brutish cavemen of old stereotypes. They were sophisticated hunters who worked together to bring down mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. They crafted complex tools, built shelters, cared for their sick and elderly. They buried their dead with what appears to be ceremony, placing flowers in graves, suggesting they understood death as something more than mere absence. They may have had language, music, even spirituality. And in the mountains and valleys of Asia, another group existed, one we would not discover until the 21st century. The Denisovans, named for the Siberian cave where their remains were first identified, were a ghost population, known more from DNA than from fossils. They lived in some of the harshest environments on Earth, from the Tibetan Plateau to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. They interbred with other human species, leaving traces of their genes in modern populations from Melanesia to Tibet. Who they were, what they looked like, how they lived, these remain mysteries. But they were there, surviving, adapting, existing alongside all the others. Homo erectus, the great wanderer, still persisted in pockets of Asia. They had been the first humans to leave Africa, spreading across the old world more than 1 million years earlier. They had mastered fire, developed hand axes, possibly even built boats to cross water barriers. They were the most successful human species ever to exist, lasting for nearly 2 million years. But by 280,000 years ago, they were in decline, their population shrinking, their range contracting. The world was changing too fast, and newer, more adaptable species were outcompeting them. And there may have been others, species we haven't yet discovered, populations that left no fossils, no DNA, no trace except perhaps in the faintest echoes of myth and memory. The fossil record is incomplete, a scattered puzzle with most pieces missing. Every few years, archaeologists uncover something new that rewrites what we thought we knew. A jawbone in a cave, a tooth in a riverbed, a fragment of skull that doesn't quite match anything we've seen before. Each discovery reminds us how little we truly understand about this time, how much remains hidden beneath the earth. Imagine standing on a hillside 280,000 years ago, looking out across a valley. In the distance, smoke rises from a fire. But whose fire? What kind of human tends those flames? If you walk down into that valley, what would you find? A family group of Homo sapiens, their faces painted with red ochre, working flint into blades. A band of Neanderthals, their children playing while adults butcher a deer. A lone Homo erectus elder, the last of a dying lineage, staring into the flames and remembering a time when the world belonged to his kind. The landscape was shared, but it was not peaceful. Resources were limited. Hunting grounds overlapped. Water sources were contested. And in that competition, in that struggle for survival, the seeds of something profound were being planted. The question was not whether these different humans would meet. They had to, eventually. The question was what would happen when they did. The evidence of contact comes to us in fragments, scattered across continents and millennia. A Neanderthal skeleton found in a cave in France, buried with care, surrounded by tools and animal bones, a funeral perhaps, or an offering. But among the bones are flint tools of a style associated with early Homo sapiens. Did they trade? Did they raid? Did they mourn together? In the Levant, the narrow corridor of land connecting Africa to Eurasia, archaeological sites reveal layers of occupation that alternate between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens artifacts. For thousands of years, the two species seem to have moved in and out of the region, perhaps following climate shifts, perhaps following prey. Sometimes they overlapped, sometimes they didn't. But the fact that they both used the same caves, the same rock shelters, the same water sources, suggests they knew of each other's existence. They must have encountered one another, if not frequently, then at least occasionally. And then there is the DNA. In 2010, scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome and made a startling discovery. Modern humans of European and Asian descent carry Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1 and 4% of their total genome. This was not contamination or error. It was evidence of interbreeding, of intimate contact between species. Somewhere, sometime, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had met, and they had not just fought or fled. They had formed relationships, had children, created hybrid lineages that carried genes from both species forward into the future. The same proved true for Denisovans. Modern Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and some Asian populations carry Denisovan DNA, sometimes as much as 5%. And the patterns are complex, suggesting multiple episodes of interbreeding across different times and places. Some populations carry genes from both Neanderthals and Denisovans. Some carry genes from archaic human populations we haven't even identified yet, ghost lineages that appear in our DNA but have left no fossils behind. What does this tell us? That when different human species met, they did not always see each other as enemies. They saw potential mates, allies, perhaps even family. A Homo sapiens woman might have joined a Neanderthal band or vice versa. Children were born who belonged to both worlds, who carried the legacy of two different evolutionary paths in their blood. These hybrids survived, thrived, passed their genes forward. We are their descendants. But interbreeding was not the only form of contact. There is evidence of violence too, though it is harder to interpret. A Neanderthal skull found in Spain shows signs of blunt force trauma that healed, suggesting the individual survived an attack. But who attacked them? Another Neanderthal? A Homo sapiens? An animal? We cannot know. A cave in Israel contains the remains of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but they are separated by thousands of years. Did one group drive the other out? Or did they simply occupy the same space at different times, unaware of each other's existence? The archaeological record is frustratingly silent on the details. We see the outcomes, one species surviving, others vanishing, but we cannot see the moments themselves. We cannot hear the conversations, witness the confrontations, understand the choices that were made. We are left to imagine, to piece together a story from the faintest of clues. Perhaps there were moments of cooperation. A Homo sapiens band caught in a sudden storm, taking shelter in a cave already occupied by Neanderthals. A tense standoff, weapons raised, eyes locked, and then slowly a lowering of spears, a gesture of peace, a shared fire, a shared meal. Stories told in different languages but understood through gesture and tone. Children playing together while adults watched warily, ready to defend but willing to coexist, at least for a night. Perhaps there were moments of tragedy. A Neanderthal family, driven from their hunting grounds by a larger, more aggressive Homo sapiens group, fleeing into the mountains, into marginal lands where game was scarce and winters were brutal, watching from a distance as smoke rose from their old caves, now occupied by strangers, knowing they could not return, knowing their children would grow up in exile, always moving, always hungry, always one step ahead of extinction. Perhaps there were moments of wonder, a young Homo sapiens hunter tracking a deer through a forest, suddenly coming face to face with a Denisovan. Two humans, two species staring at each other across a clearing, recognizing something familiar in each other's eyes, intelligence, curiosity, fear, and then, without a word, each turning and walking away, leaving the encounter as a memory that would be told and retold around fires for generations, becoming myth, becoming legend, becoming the story of the time when humans were not alone. But survival always has a price, and in the struggle for existence, cooperation can only go so far. The question that haunts researchers is not whether different human species interacted, but why only one survived. What gave Homo sapiens the edge? What allowed us to spread across the globe while Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus and all the others faded into extinction? The answers are complex and no single factor explains everything. But patterns emerge when we look closely at the evidence. Patterns that suggest our survival was not inevitable, not preordained, but the result of countless small advantages that accumulated over tens of thousands of years. One advantage was adaptability. Homo sapiens seemed to have been more flexible in their behaviour than other human species. Neanderthals were superbly adapted to Ice Age Europe, but when the climate shifted, they struggled to adjust. Their hunting techniques, their tools, their social structures were all optimised for a specific environment. When that environment changed, they could not change fast enough. Homo sapiens, by contrast, were generalists. They could hunt large game or gather shellfish. They could live in forests or deserts or grasslands. They could innovate rapidly, developing new tools and techniques to suit new challenges. This flexibility allowed them to survive in a wider range of environments, to exploit resources that other species could not access. Another advantage was social organisation. There is evidence that Homo sapiens lived in larger, more complex social groups than Neanderthals. Larger groups meant more hunters, more gatherers, more knowledge shared across generations. They could defend larger territories, exploit resources more efficiently, and support more children to adulthood. Neanderthals, by contrast, seem to have lived in smaller, more isolated bands. This made them vulnerable to local extinctions, a harsh winter, a failed hunt. A disease outbreak could wipe out an entire group, and there might be no one nearby to repopulate the area. Language may have played a role as well. While Neanderthals almost certainly had some form of communication, possibly even language, there is debate about how sophisticated it was. Homo sapiens seem to have developed more complex symbolic thought earlier, as evidenced by cave paintings, carved figurines, and elaborate burial practices. Language allows for the transmission of complex ideas, the coordination of large groups, the preservation of knowledge across generations. If Homo sapiens had even a slight advantage in linguistic ability, it could have compounded over time, allowing them to outthink, outplan, and outmaneuver their competitors. Technology was another factor. Homo sapiens developed more sophisticated tools, including projectile weapons like spears and later bows and arrows. These allowed them to hunt from a distance, reducing the risk of injury and increasing success rates. Neanderthals relied more on close-quarters hunting, using thrusting spears to kill large animals at close range. This was effective, but dangerous, and Neanderthal skeletons show high rates of traumatic injuries consistent with being gored, trampled, or mauled by prey. Over time, the safer, more efficient hunting methods of Homo sapiens would have given them a demographic advantage. More hunters surviving to reproduce, more children reaching adulthood. But perhaps the most significant advantage was simply numbers. Homo sapiens populations seem to have been larger and more widespread than those of other human species. In any competition for resources, numbers matter. A larger population can absorb losses more easily, can expand into new territories more aggressively, can outcompete smaller groups simply through sheer presence. If Homo sapiens outnumbered Neanderthals even slightly, that advantage would have grown over time, as more resources flowed to the larger population, allowing them to grow even larger while the smaller population shrank. And then there is the possibility of direct conflict. Not war as we understand it today, with armies and battles and strategies, but something more primal. Competition for hunting grounds, for water sources, for the best caves and rock shelters. When two groups of humans encountered each other, both needing the same resources to survive, violence may have been inevitable, and in those confrontations the group with better weapons, larger numbers, and more sophisticated tactics would have prevailed. Over thousands of years these small victories would have added up, pushing other human species into ever more marginal environments, until they could no longer sustain viable populations. But there is another theory, one that is harder to prove but impossible to dismiss. What if the extinction of other human species was not the result of direct competition, but of something more insidious? What if Homo sapiens carried diseases to which they were immune but other species were not? When populations that have been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly come into contact, disease can spread with devastating speed. We see this pattern throughout history. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, They brought smallpox, measles and influenza, diseases that killed millions of indigenous people who had no immunity. Could something similar have happened 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa and encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans? Could a pathogen, harmless to us, have been lethal to them? There is no direct evidence for this, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Diseases leave no fossils, viruses do not preserve in the archaeological record, but the pattern fits. Rapid population declines in Neanderthals and other species coinciding with the arrival of Homo sapiens in their territories. It is possible, even likely, that disease played a role in the extinctions, even if we can never prove it definitively. And then there are the whispers of something stranger, something that pushes the boundaries of what we can know and what we can only wonder about. What if our rise was not entirely natural? What if something accelerated our development, gave us an edge that cannot be explained by evolution alone? Ancient mythologies from around the world tell remarkably similar stories. Gods descending from the heavens, beings of light and power shaping humanity, teaching us language, agriculture, astronomy. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, divine beings who created humans to serve them. The Egyptians told of gods who walked among men in the time before the pharaohs. The Mayans believed their ancestors were fashioned from maize by the gods. The Aboriginal Australians speak of the dream time when ancestral beings shaped the land and created the first people. These are myths, of course, stories told to explain the inexplicable, to give meaning to existence, to connect the present to a distant, half-remembered past. But what if they are also memories? Not literal, not historical in the way we understand history, but echoes of something that really happened, distorted by time and retelling, but rooted in actual events. Consider the sudden flowering of human culture around 50,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, human technology and behaviour changed slowly, incrementally. Stone tools improved gradually, social structures evolved over millennia, and then, suddenly, everything accelerated. Cave paintings appeared, carved figurines, musical instruments, elaborate burials, long-distance trade networks. Symbolic thought exploded into being, as if a switch had been flipped in the human mind. Mainstream science explains this as the result of a cognitive revolution, a rewiring of the brain that allowed for more complex abstract thought. But what caused this rewiring? Was it a random mutation, a lucky genetic accident that happened to occur at just the right time, or was it something else? Some researchers have proposed that the cognitive revolution was triggered by environmental pressures, climate change forcing humans to innovate or die. Others suggest it was the result of population growth, which allowed for more specialization and the accumulation of knowledge. Still others point to the development of language as the key factor, enabling the transmission of complex ideas and the coordination of large groups. But there are those who wonder if the explanation might be more exotic. What if there was an intervention, not by gods or aliens in the literal sense, but by something we don't yet understand? A cosmic event, perhaps. A burst of radiation from a distant supernova, mutating DNA in just the right way to unlock new cognitive abilities. Or contact with another intelligence, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but perhaps something older, something that existed on Earth before us and left no trace except in our genes and our myths. This is speculation, of course. There is no evidence for any of this. But the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. And the fact remains that something happened around 50,000 years ago, something that set Homo sapiens on a trajectory that would lead to the complete domination of the planet. We went from being one species among many to being the only human species left. We went from small bands of hunter-gatherers to builders of cities, creators of art, explorers of the cosmos. And we did it in the blink of an eye, evolutionarily speaking. What if the myths are trying to tell us something? What if the stories of gods shaping humanity are garbled memories of a time when something did shape us, did accelerate our development, did give us the tools we needed to survive and thrive while all other human species fell away? The Neanderthals had larger brains than us. They were stronger, more robust, better adapted to their environment. By all rights, they should have been the ones to inherit the Earth. But they didn't. We did. Why? Perhaps it was all the factors mentioned earlier: adaptability, social organization, technology, numbers, disease. Perhaps it was simply luck, a series of fortunate accidents that favored us over them. Or perhaps it was something else, something we glimpse only in the shadows of our oldest stories, something that happened so long ago that we can no longer remember it clearly, only feel its echo in the deepest parts of our collective unconscious. The Denisovans left us genes that allow modern Tibetans to survive at high altitudes, genes that help Melanesians resist certain tropical diseases. What else did they leave us? What knowledge, what abilities, what memories are buried in our DNA, waiting to be rediscovered? And what of the other species, the ones we haven't found yet? The ghost populations that appear in our genetic studies but have left no fossils. What were they? Where did they live? What did they know? And what happened to them? The more we learn, the more questions arise, and in those questions lies a profound unease, a sense that the story we tell ourselves about human origins is incomplete, that there are chapters missing, pages torn out, whole volumes lost to time. Imagine a meeting, 40,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now France. A band of Homo sapiens, perhaps 20 strong, moving through a valley in search of game. They are confident, well-armed, their children healthy and numerous. They have come from the south following the herds, and they have heard stories of others who live in these lands. Others who are like them but not like them, who speak differently, who look different, who have lived here since before memory. They find a cave, smoke rising from its entrance. They approach cautiously, weapons ready. And there, at the mouth of the cave, they see them, Neanderthals. A family group, perhaps a dozen individuals. The two groups stare at each other across the clearing. What happens next? Do they fight? Do they flee? Or do they simply stand there, two kinds of humanity face to face, each recognizing something familiar in the other's eyes, but also something alien, something that marks them as separate, as different, as competitors for the same resources in a world that cannot support them both? Perhaps words are exchanged, though neither group understands the other's language. Perhaps gestures are made, a raised hand, a lowered spear, an offer of food, or a warning to leave. Perhaps the Neanderthals, seeing the larger numbers of the Homo sapiens group, decide to withdraw, to move deeper into the mountains, to find another place to live. Perhaps the Homo sapiens, seeing the strength and determination of the Neanderthals, decide to move on, to find another valley, another cave, another hunting ground. Or perhaps they fight. A brief brutal clash, spears thrown, stones hurled, bodies falling, and when it is over, the Homo sapiens group claims the cave, buries their dead, and moves on with their lives. The Neanderthals, if any survive, scatter into the wilderness, their numbers diminished, their future uncertain. We will never know what actually happened in that moment or in the thousands of similar moments that must have occurred across Europe, Asia, and Africa over tens of thousands of years. But we know the outcome. The Neanderthals disappeared, the Denisovans vanished, Homo erectus faded into extinction, and Homo sapiens spread across the globe, adapting to every environment, filling every niche, becoming the dominant species on the planet. But we did not do it alone. We carry pieces of them with us, in our genes, in our immune systems, in the shape of our skulls and the structure of our brains. We are not purely Homo sapiens. We are hybrids, the product of countless encounters, countless unions, countless moments when different human species came together and created something new. And perhaps we carry more than just genes. Perhaps we carry memories too, not conscious memories, but something deeper, something encoded in the structure of our minds. The fear of the dark, the unease we feel in deep forests, the sense that we are being watched. Could these be echoes of a time when we were not alone, when other humans moved through the shadows, when every encounter with a stranger could mean death? Our myths speak of monsters and demons, of creatures that are almost human but not quite, that live in the wild places and prey on the unwary. The trolls of Scandinavian folklore, the Yeti of the Himalayas, the Sasquatch of North America. Could these be distorted memories of Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other human species, passed down through countless generations until they became legend? It sounds absurd, and yet the timing is suggestive. The last Neanderthals died out around 40,000 years ago, but Homo sapiens had been in Europe for thousands of years before that. For a long time, the two species coexisted, living in the same landscapes, hunting the same animals, sheltering in the same caves. And then the Neanderthals were gone, but the stories remained. Stories of wild men in the forests, of creatures that were almost human but not quite, of beings that could be dangerous but also sometimes helpful. The Aboriginal Australians have stories of the Yaramaihahu, a small red-skinned creature that lives in fig trees and preys on travellers. Could this be a memory of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit species that lived on the Indonesian island of Flores until at least 50,000 years ago? The Aboriginals arrived in Australia around 65,000 years ago, and they would have passed through Indonesia on their way. Could they have encountered Homo floresiensis? Could the memory of those encounters have been preserved in their oral traditions for tens of thousands of years? It seems impossible, and yet oral traditions have been shown to preserve information for remarkably long periods. Aboriginal Australian stories about coastal flooding have been verified by geological evidence showing that the events described occurred more than 10,000 years ago. If stories can preserve memories of landscape changes for that long, why not memories of encounters with other human species? The truth is, we don't know. We can only speculate, only wonder, only piece together fragments of evidence, and try to imagine what life was like in that distant time when humanity was plural, when the world was shared by many kinds of humans, each with their own cultures, their own languages, their own ways of understanding the world. And in the silence of extinction, our story began. The final Neanderthals lived in isolated pockets, clinging to existence in the mountains of Spain and the caves of Gibraltar. They were the last of their kind, the survivors of a species that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. But the world had changed around them. The climate was shifting again, the ice age waning, and with it the great herds of reindeer and mammoth that had sustained them. And everywhere, pressing in from all sides, were the newcomers, Homo sapiens, with their superior numbers, their advanced weapons, their relentless expansion. We don't know how the last Neanderthal died. Perhaps it was an old woman, alone in a cave, the last of her family, the last of her people. Perhaps she looked out at the valley below and saw smoke rising from Homo sapiens camps, heard their voices carried on the wind, and knew that her time was ending. Perhaps she remembered stories told by her grandmother, stories of a time when Neanderthals were many, when they ruled the land, when the future seemed secure. And perhaps she wondered what had gone wrong, why her people were fading while the others thrived. Or perhaps the last Neanderthal was a child, born into a dying world, never knowing that he was the last of his kind. Perhaps he grew up among Homo sapiens, adopted or captured, learning their language, their customs, their ways. Perhaps he lived a long life, had children of his own, hybrid children who carried Neanderthal genes forward into the future. Perhaps he died peacefully, surrounded by family, never knowing that he was the end of a lineage that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. We will never know. The fossil record is silent on the details. But we know that around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record. No more Neanderthal tools, No more Neanderthal burials, no more Neanderthal art. They were gone, and with them went an entire way of being human, an entire branch of the human family tree. The Denisovans lasted longer, perhaps. Their range was vast, stretching from Siberia to Southeast Asia, and they may have survived in isolated pockets until relatively recently. There are hints in the genetic record of interbreeding between Denisovans and Homo sapiens as recently as 15,000 years ago, though this is controversial and not universally accepted. But eventually, they too vanished, leaving behind only traces in our DNA and a handful of bone fragments in a Siberian cave. Homo erectus, the great survivor, the species that had lasted for nearly 2 million years, finally succumbed around 100,000 years ago, though some populations may have persisted longer in isolated areas. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit of Flores Island, survived until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly later. And there may have been others, species we haven't discovered yet, that lasted even longer, living in remote corners of the world, slowly dwindling, slowly fading, until one day they were simply gone. And then there was only us. Homo sapiens, the last human species, the sole survivors of a great winnowing that had reduced the diversity of humanity to a single lineage. We spread across the globe, adapting to every environment, from the Arctic tundra to the tropical rainforest to the deserts of Australia. We developed agriculture, built cities, created art and music and literature. We split the atom, walked on the moon, peered into the depths of space and time. We became, in a very real sense, the masters of the earth. But at what cost? What did we lose when the other human species disappeared? What knowledge, what perspectives, what ways of understanding the world vanished with them? The Neanderthals had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew the land intimately, knew the rhythms of the seasons, the migrations of the animals, the properties of every plant and stone. All of that knowledge died with them. The Denisovans had adapted to some of the harshest environments on Earth, from the oxygen-thin air of the Tibetan Plateau to the tropical heat of Southeast Asia. They had learned to survive in places where survival seemed impossible. All of that wisdom was lost, and perhaps we lost something more intangible too. Perhaps we lost the experience of living in a world where humanity was diverse, where different kinds of humans coexisted, where being human meant something more than just being Homo sapiens. Perhaps we lost the humility that comes from knowing you are not alone, not unique, not the only intelligent species on the planet. Perhaps we lost the sense of wonder that comes from encountering another kind of human, someone who is like you but also different, someone who challenges your assumptions about what it means to be human. Or perhaps we gained something. Perhaps the struggle for survival, the competition with other human species, forced us to become more innovative, more adaptable, more cooperative. Perhaps it was that struggle that forged us into the species we are today, that gave us the drive to explore, to create, to push beyond every boundary. Perhaps we are who we are because of what we overcame, because of the challenges we faced and survived. But the question remains, did we overcome them, or did we destroy them? Were we the victors in a struggle for survival, or were we the perpetrators of the first genocide, the first extinction of an intelligent species by another? The evidence is ambiguous, and perhaps it always will be. We can point to interbreeding, to cooperation, to peaceful coexistence, but we can also point to the fact that every other human species disappeared shortly after Homo sapiens arrived in their territories. Correlation is not causation, but the pattern is hard to ignore, and so we are left with a mystery, a question that may never be fully answered. What happened 280,000 years ago, and in the tens of thousands of years that followed? What was the nature of the struggle between human species? Was it a war, a competition, a slow displacement, or something more complex? Something that involved all of these elements and more? The bones in the ground cannot tell us. The DNA in our cells hints at the answer, but does not reveal it fully. The myths and legends passed down through countless generations whisper of a time when humans were not alone, but the whispers are faint, distorted by time and retelling. We are left to wonder, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some questions meant to linger unanswered. Perhaps the story of humanity's origins is not a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, but a story that continues to unfold, a story that we are still living, still discovering, still trying to understand. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that distant world again. Imagine the fires flickering in caves across Europe, Asia, Africa. Imagine different kinds of humans gathered around those fires, telling stories in languages we will never hear, dreaming dreams we can never know. Imagine the children playing, the elders watching, the hunters returning with game, the gatherers sorting through the day's harvest of roots and berries. Imagine a world where humanity was not singular, but plural, where being human meant something more diverse, more complex, more wondrous than we can fully comprehend today. Imagine the encounters between different human species, the moments of fear and wonder, of violence and cooperation, of love and loss. Imagine the slow, inexorable process by which one species came to dominate while all the others faded away. And imagine that we carry them with us still, not just in our genes, though we do carry their genes, fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA woven into our own, but in our memories too, not conscious memories, but something deeper, something that lives in the oldest parts of our brains, in the instincts and intuitions that guide us without our knowing. The fear of the dark, the unease in deep forests, the sense that we are being watched, the dreams of being chased by something almost human but not quite. Could these be echoes of a time when we were not alone, when other humans moved through the world alongside us, when every encounter with a stranger could mean death or alliance, danger or opportunity? The myths of gods and monsters, of beings that shaped humanity, of creatures that are almost human but not quite. Could these be distorted memories of Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus and all the others? Could the stories we tell ourselves about our origins contain kernels of truth, fragments of actual events that occurred so long ago that we can no longer separate fact from fiction? We don't know. We can only wonder. And in that wondering lies something profound, something that connects us to our deepest past, to the time before history, before civilization, before we became the only human species left on Earth. Perhaps the struggle between human species never truly ended. Perhaps it simply changed form. We no longer compete with Neanderthals or Denisovans, but we still compete with each other, tribe against tribe, nation against nation, ideology against ideology. We still struggle for resources, for territory, for survival. We still fear the other, the stranger, the one who is like us but not quite like us. And perhaps, in understanding what happened 280,000 years ago, in understanding how our ancestors interacted with other human species, we can learn something about ourselves. We can learn about the capacity for both violence and cooperation that lies within us. We can learn about the importance of diversity, of different perspectives, of different ways of being human. We can learn about the consequences of allowing one group to dominate all others, of allowing one way of thinking to crowd out all alternatives. The Neanderthals are gone, the Denisovans are gone, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, and all the others are gone. But we remain, and in our remaining we carry a responsibility to remember them, to honour them, to learn from their disappearance, to ensure that the diversity of humanity, even if it is now limited to a single species, is preserved and celebrated rather than suppressed and destroyed. Because the story of 280,000 years ago is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about who we are and how we got here. It is a story about the choices our ancestors made, the struggles they faced, the victories they won, and the losses they suffered. And it is a story about the future, about the choices we will make, the struggles we will face, the kind of world we will create for those who come after us. Will we learn from the past, or will we repeat it? Will we embrace diversity, or will we seek to eliminate it? Will we cooperate with those who are different from us, or will we compete until only one way of being human remains? These are the questions that echo down through the millennia, from that distant time when humanity was plural to this present moment when humanity is singular. These are the questions that the bones in the ground and the DNA in our cells are asking us, if only we have the wisdom to listen. And so, as you drift into sleep, let the story linger in your mind. Let it settle into your dreams, where ancient fires still flicker and different kinds of humans still walk the earth. Let it remind you that we are not the first humans, only the last, that we are not alone, even in our aloneness, because we carry the others with us, in our genes, in our memories, in the deepest structures of our minds. The struggle between human species may have ended 40,000 years ago, or it may have ended much more recently, or it may not have ended at all. Perhaps it continues still, in different forms, in different ways. Perhaps it will always continue, as long as humans exist, as long as we struggle to survive, to thrive, to understand our place in the world. But one thing is certain, we are here because they were there. We exist because they existed. We are the inheritors of their struggles, their triumphs, their failures. We are the product of 280,000 years of human evolution, of competition and cooperation, of violence and love, of extinction and survival. And in that inheritance lies both a burden and a gift. The burden of remembering, of honouring, of learning from the past, and the gift of existence itself of being the ones who survived, who carried the torch of humanity forward into an uncertain future. So sleep now and dream of that ancient world. Dream of the fires in the caves, the voices in the darkness, the footsteps in the snow. Dream of the time when humanity was many, when the earth was shared by different kinds of humans, each with their own story, their own destiny. And when you wake, remember that their story is our story, that their struggle is our struggle, that their legacy lives on in us, in every breath we take, in every thought we think, in every choice we make. We are the last humans, but we are not alone. We never were, and we never will be, because the others are still with us, woven into the fabric of our being, whispering to us from the depths of time, reminding us of where we came from and who we are. And perhaps in the end, that is the greatest mystery of all. Not what happened 280,000 years ago, but what it means for us today. Not how we survived, but why. Not what we lost when the other human species disappeared, but what we gained. And not whether we were the victors or the villains in that ancient struggle, but whether we can learn from it, grow from it, become something more than we are. The fires have long since gone out. The voices have fallen silent. The footsteps have faded into dust. But the story continues, carried forward by us, the last humans, the inheritors of a legacy we are only beginning to understand. And in that story, in that mystery, in that endless wondering about what came before and what might come after, lies the essence of what it means to be human. Not just Homo sapiens, but human in the deepest sense. Curious, creative, capable of both great cruelty and great compassion, forever seeking to understand our place in the vast sweep of time. The struggle between human species may have ended long ago, but the struggle to understand what it means to be human continues, and it will continue as long as we exist, as long as we remember, as long as we wonder about the ancient fires that once burned in caves across the world, tended by hands that were like ours but not quite like ours, by minds that dreamed dreams we can never fully know. Sleep now, and let the mystery linger. Let it settle into your bones, into your blood, into the deepest parts of your being. Because you are part of that mystery. You are the living answer to a question that was asked 280,000 years ago. When the first humans looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond the horizon. You're here because they were there, and that perhaps is the greatest truth of all. But let us not end there, in the comfortable abstraction of philosophical truth. Let us instead walk into the caves themselves, into the places where the evidence lies scattered like breadcrumbs through time, where the earth still holds the secrets of those ancient encounters, where stone and bone and DNA whisper stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about our singular place in the world. In the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq there is a cave called Shanidar, a name that means nothing to most people but everything to those who study the deep past. It is a place of shadows and limestone, of cool darkness that has sheltered living things for tens of thousands of years. And it is there, in layers of sediment that speak of ice ages and warming periods, of floods and droughts and the slow turning of seasons across millennia, that we find them. The Neanderthals of Shanidar, buried with a care that suggests something we once thought belonged only to us. The most famous is Shanidar IV, discovered in 1960, a middle-aged male whose grave was found to contain pollen from flowers, yarrow, cornflower, hollyhock, groundsel. For decades, this was interpreted as evidence of a funeral ritual, of mourning, of the kind of symbolic thought that we associate with consciousness and spirituality. The image captured the imagination. Neanderthals gathering flowers, laying them gently around their dead, perhaps speaking words we will never hear, perhaps singing songs that have dissolved into the silence of deep time. Later analysis suggested the pollen might have been introduced by rodents, by the natural processes of cave ecology, by anything other than intentional human action. But even if the flowers were not placed there by grieving hands, even if that particular story is not true, the cave still speaks. Because Shanidar I, another individual from the same site, tells a story that cannot be explained away by rodents or coincidence. Shanidar I was a male who lived to be approximately 40 years old, which in Neanderthal terms was ancient, a remarkable achievement in a world where injury and disease and the constant struggle for survival claimed most lives long before middle age. But what makes him extraordinary is not his age but his injuries. His left arm had been amputated above the elbow, either through trauma or deliberate surgery, years before his death. He had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his face that had left him partially blind. He had injuries to his legs and feet that would have made walking difficult. And yet he lived. He survived for years after these catastrophic injuries, which means someone took care of him, someone brought him food, someone protected him when he could not protect himself. Someone valued his life enough to keep him alive when natural. Selection would have discarded him without a second thought. What does this tell us? That compassion is not a human invention, not something that emerged with Homo sapiens and our supposedly superior consciousness. That the capacity to care for the vulnerable, to see value in a life beyond its immediate utility, existed in other human species, in minds that were different from ours but not lesser, not primitive, not the brutish caricatures that early anthropology imagined. And if Neanderthals could feel compassion, could mourn their dead, could care for the injured and the old, then what else could they feel? What other emotions, what other thoughts, what other experiences of consciousness existed in those minds that are now forever silent? Thousands of miles to the east, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, another cave holds another set of secrets. Denisova Cave is a place of layers, of stratigraphy that reads like a book written in sediment and bone, telling the story of occupation that spans hundreds of thousands of years. And it is here that we found them, the Denisovans, a species we knew nothing about until a single finger bone, a fragment so small it could fit in the palm of your hand, revealed through DNA analysis that there had been another human species living in Asia, contemporary with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, interbreeding with both, leaving genetic traces in modern populations from Melanesia to Tibet, but almost no fossil record to speak of. Think about that for a moment. An entire species of human, one that lived and loved and struggled and died across vast stretches of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, and we know them from a finger bone, a few teeth, a fragment of skull. What were they like? What did they look like? We can reconstruct some things from DNA. They likely had dark skin, brown eyes, dark hair, a robust build adapted to cold climates. But what about the things that matter more? What did they think about? What did they fear? What did they dream? Did they tell stories around their fires? Did they have names for the stars? Did they wonder as we wonder about their place in the universe? The cave itself suggests complexity. Multiple human species used it, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes in succession. Neanderthals left their tools in some layers, Denisovans in others, and Homo sapiens arriving later left evidence of their presence as well. Were there moments when they encountered each other in that cave, in those mountain passages? Did a Denisovan mother ever look up from her fire to see a Neanderthal family passing through the valley below? Did they trade? Did they fight? Did they simply avoid each other, each group keeping to their own territories, their own hunting grounds, their own sacred places? And then there is the most remarkable discovery of all. Denisova 11, nicknamed Denny, a bone fragment from a girl who died approximately 90,000 years ago. DNA analysis revealed something extraordinary. Her mother was a Neanderthal, her father a Denisovan. She was a hybrid, a living bridge between two species, proof that the boundaries between human groups were not as rigid as we once imagined. What was her life like? Did she belong to her mother's group or her father's? Did she feel caught between two worlds? Or did such distinctions not matter in the way we imagine they might? Did she have siblings, half Neanderthal and half Denisovan like herself? Did she have children? Did her genetic legacy continue? Or did it end with her, this girl whose existence we know only from a fragment of bone smaller than a coin? In Spain, in a cave system called Atapuerca, we find evidence of even earlier human species, of Homo heidelbergensis and their descendants, of populations that existed hundreds of thousands of years before the time we're discussing, but whose legacy shaped everything that came after. The Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, contains the remains of at least 28 individuals who died approximately 430,000 years ago, their bodies deposited in a deep shaft in what appears to be a deliberate act. Were they thrown there after death as part of a burial ritual? Were they killed and disposed of? Were they victims of an accident, a fall into darkness from which there was no escape? We do not know, but what we do know is that among the bones was found a single hand axe made of red quartzite, a beautiful object that had never been used, that showed no signs of wear, that appeared to have been made specifically to be placed with the dead. An offering? A grave good? A symbol of something we cannot begin to understand. These sites, scattered across continents, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, tell us that the story of human evolution is not a simple line from primitive to advanced, from brutish to enlightened, from them to us. It is a web, a tangle, a complex network of populations that moved and mixed and separated and came together again, that shared genes and ideas and perhaps even stories, that were all in their own ways human. And the more we dig, the more we analyse, the more we apply new technologies to old bones, the more complex and beautiful and tragic the story becomes. What did we inherit from them, these other humans who walked the earth when our species was young? The question is not merely academic, not simply a matter of scientific curiosity. It is personal. It is intimate. Because their genes flow through us still, carried forward through hundreds of generations, shaping who we are in ways we are only beginning to understand. If you are of European or Asian descent, Approximately 2 to 3% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. If you are of Melanesian descent, you carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, along with some Neanderthal genes as well. If you are of African descent, you carry less of these archaic genes, but recent studies have revealed that you too carry DNA from other, as yet unidentified human species that lived in Africa, species we know only through the genetic shadows they left behind. None of us are pure Homo sapiens. All of us are hybrids, mixtures, the living result of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago between people who were like us but not quite like us, who saw in each other something familiar enough to desire, different enough to be exotic, human enough to create children who survived and thrived and passed those mixed genes forward through time until they reached us. Here, now, reading these words. But what do these genes do? What did we gain from these ancient encounters? The answers are surprising, sometimes unsettling, always fascinating. From Neanderthals, we inherited genes that affect our immune systems, that help us fight off certain pathogens, that gave our ancestors an advantage when they moved into new environments where they encountered diseases their African immune systems had never seen before. We inherited genes that affect skin and hair color, adaptations to the reduced sunlight of northern latitudes. We inherited genes that affect our metabolism, our ability to process certain foods, our susceptibility to certain diseases. Some Neanderthal genes increase the risk of depression, of nicotine addiction, of blood clotting disorders. Others provide protection against certain types of infection, certain autoimmune conditions, certain environmental stresses. From Denisovans, Tibetan populations inherited a gene variant called EPAS1 that helps them survive at high altitudes, that allows their bodies to function efficiently in the thin air of the Himalayas where oxygen is scarce and every breath is a struggle. This gene, passed from Denisovans to Homo sapiens perhaps 40,000 years ago, has allowed Tibetan people to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, to build civilizations at elevations where most humans would suffer from altitude sickness, where the air itself seems to resist human habitation. Without that Denisovan gene, the history of Tibet would be entirely different. Without that ancient encounter, that moment of intimacy between two human species in the mountains of Asia, an entire culture might never have existed. And there are other genes, other inheritances that we are only beginning to understand. Genes that affect brain development, that influence the shape and structure of our skulls, that may even affect cognition and behavior in subtle ways we cannot yet measure. What did Neanderthal consciousness feel like? We cannot know, not directly, but we carry pieces of their neurology within us, fragments of their way of being in the world, and perhaps in those fragments lie clues to experiences of reality that are different from the standard human baseline, that add diversity and richness to the spectrum of human consciousness. But beyond the specific genes, beyond the measurable biological inheritances, there is something else, something harder to quantify but no less real. We inherited their survival. We inherited their persistence. We inherited the fact that they endured through ice ages and droughts, through volcanic winters and climate shifts, through all the catastrophes that the Earth could throw at them for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus, the great survivor, persisted for nearly 2 million years, spreading from Africa to Asia, adapting to environments from tropical forests to temperate grasslands, creating tools and using fire and raising children and burying their dead across a span of time so vast that it makes our entire recorded history seem like a brief moment, a flicker, a single breath. And we inherited their capacity for love. Because that is what the evidence suggests, isn't it? The care for the injured at Shanidar, the burial of the dead at Cima de los Huesos, the hybrid children like Denny, who could only have been born from encounters that involved not just sex but some form of acceptance, some willingness to see the other as a potential partner, as someone worthy of intimacy. We like to imagine that love is uniquely human, uniquely ours, a product of our advanced consciousness and our complex social structures. But what if love is older than Homo sapiens? What if it existed in Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo erectus and all the other human species that came before us? What if the capacity to care for another, to value another's existence, to feel joy in their presence and grief in their absence, is not a human invention, but a human inheritance, something we receive from ancestors who are human in a different way but human nonetheless? Think about what this means. Think about the implications. Every time you feel compassion for a stranger, every time you help someone who cannot help you in return, every time you create art or music or stories not for survival, but for beauty, for meaning, for the sheer joy of creation, you're expressing something that is older than our species, something that connects you not just to your Homo sapiens ancestors, but to all the human species that came before, to the entire human family and all its diversity and complexity and wonder. In a cave in Spain called El Castillo, there are handprints on the wall, stencils made by placing a hand against the stone and blowing pigment around it, leaving a negative image, a shadow, a presence. These handprints are at least 40,000 years old, possibly older, and some researchers believe they may have been made by Neanderthals rather than Homo sapiens. We cannot be certain. The dating is difficult, the attribution uncertain. But the possibility alone is enough to make you stop and think. Because if Neanderthals made those handprints, if they stood in that cave and placed their hands against the cold stone, and blew red ochre through a hollow bone or reed, creating an image that would last for tens of thousands of years, then what does that tell us about their minds, their consciousness, their sense of self? To make a handprint is to say, I was here, I existed. I leave this mark as proof of my presence, as a message to whoever comes after, as a way of reaching across time to touch the future. It is an act of profound symbolic thought, of self-awareness, of the understanding that there is a past and a future, and that one's own existence is a point between them, a moment that can be recorded, remembered, preserved. And if Neanderthals could think this way, could conceive of themselves as beings in time, as individuals whose existence mattered enough to be recorded, then they were not the primitive brutes of early anthropology, but conscious beings with an inner life as rich and complex as our own. In other caves we find more evidence of Neanderthal art and symbolism, carved bones, perforated shells that may have been worn as jewellery, pigments that were ground and mixed and applied to bodies or objects or cave walls. In Bruniquel Cave in France, deep underground in a chamber that requires crawling through narrow passages to reach, Neanderthals built structures from stalagmites, breaking them off and arranging them in circles and lines, creating something that served no obvious practical purpose, that required planning and cooperation and effort, that speaks of ritual, of ceremony, of the kind of symbolic behaviour that we associate with religion and spirituality. What were they doing in that deep chamber, so far from the light, in a place that required deliberate effort to reach? Were they performing rituals? Were they initiating young people into adulthood? Were they communing with spirits, with ancestors, with forces they believed controlled the world? We do not know. We cannot know. But the structures are there, undeniable, dated to approximately 176,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, proof that Neanderthals were capable of complex symbolic thought, of creating meaning beyond the immediate demands of survival. And if they had ritual, did they have religion? Did they believe in gods, in spirits, in an afterlife? The burial evidence suggests they might have. Not all Neanderthal burials show signs of ritual. Many are simple, pragmatic, bodies placed in the ground without ceremony, but some do show evidence of care, of deliberate positioning, of objects placed with the dead. And care for the dead implies belief in something beyond death, doesn't it? Or at least a sense that the dead deserve respect, that they are not simply meat to be discarded, but individuals whose existence mattered, whose absence is felt, whose memory should be preserved. Imagine a Neanderthal funeral, 50,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now France. The group gathers around the body of an elder, a woman who has lived longer than most, who has survived childbirth and injury and illness, who has seen seasons turn and herds migrate, and children grow into adults. They have dug a shallow grave in the floor of the cave, and they place her body in it carefully, positioning her on her side with her knees drawn up, her hands near her face in a posture that suggests sleep rather than death. Someone places a stone tool near her hand, a scraper she used for working hides, worn smooth from years of use. Someone else places a piece of red ochre near her head, the same pigment they use to decorate their bodies for ceremonies, for celebrations, for moments when the ordinary world needs to be transformed into something sacred. And then they cover her with earth, slowly, carefully, and perhaps someone speaks, though we will never know what words they used, what language they spoke, what concepts they had for death and memory and the continuation of existence beyond the body. Did they believe she would wake in another world? Did they believe her spirit would join the ancestors? Did they believe anything at all? Or was the burial simply an expression of grief, of the need to do something, anything, to mark the passing of a life that mattered? We cannot know, but we can recognize the impulse, can't we? Because we still do the same thing. We still gather around our dead. We still place objects with them, things they loved, things that represent who they were. We still speak words, perform rituals, create ceremonies that help us process the impossible fact of death, the absence of someone who was present, the silence where there was once a voice. And if we inherited anything from Neanderthals, perhaps we inherited this: the need to mark death with ritual, to transform the biological fact of mortality into something meaningful, something that connects us to each other and to the past and to whatever we believe comes after. But what about joy? What about beauty? Did Neanderthals create art not just for ritual but for pleasure, for the sheer delight of making something beautiful? The evidence is limited, but it exists. Carved patterns on bones that serve no practical purpose, shells collected from beaches and brought inland, perforated and worn as ornaments, pigments mixed and applied with care. These are not the actions of beings who live only in the present, who think only of survival. These are the actions of beings who have time for beauty, who see value in decoration, who understand that life is not just about eating and sleeping and reproducing, but about creating meaning, about making the world more interesting, more beautiful, more alive. And if Neanderthals could appreciate beauty, could create art, could find joy in decoration and ornament, and the transformation of ordinary objects into something special, then they were not so different from us, were they? They were not the other, not the primitive, not the evolutionary dead end that we once imagined. They were human, in the deepest sense of the word. They were conscious beings with an inner life, with emotions and thoughts and experiences that we can recognize even across the vast gulf of time that separates us. And when they disappeared, when the last Neanderthal died and their unique way of being in the world was lost forever, something precious was lost with them, something we can never recover, a perspective on reality that was different from ours but no less valid, no less valuable, no less worthy of existence. Let me tell you about someone who never existed, except that in a sense she did. Let me tell you about Kira, a name I'm giving her because she deserves a name, because she was a person, an individual, someone who lived and breathed and felt and thought, even though we will never know what she actually called herself, what sounds her people used to distinguish her from others, what identity she carried in her own mind. Kira was a Neanderthal woman who lived approximately 45,000 years ago in what is now southern France. She was born in late spring when the world was turning green and the herds were moving north and food was abundant. Her mother laboured for hours in the back of a cave while other women attended her, bringing water, speaking words of encouragement, helping in the ways that women have always helped each other through the ordeal of birth. And when Kira finally emerged slick and screaming into the world, her mother held her close and felt the same overwhelming rush of love that mothers have felt across all human species, across all time, the fierce protective instinct that says, "This is mine. This is precious. I will do anything to keep this being alive. Kira grew up in a world that was both beautiful and harsh. In summer, the valleys were lush with grass and flowers, and the herds of reindeer and horses and bison moved through in numbers that seemed endless. In winter, the cold was brutal, and the group huddled together in their cave, burning fires constantly, wearing layers of fur and hide, venturing out only when necessary to hunt or gather wood or check the snares they had set for small game. She learned to read the landscape, to know which plants were edible and which were poisonous, to track animals by their footprints and droppings, to predict weather by the behaviour of birds and the smell of the wind. She learned to make tools, to strike flakes from flint cores, to shape scrapers and points and knives with a skill that took years to develop. She learned to work hides, to scrape away the fat and flesh, to stretch and dry them, to sew them into clothing using bone needles and sinew thread. But she also learned other things that had nothing to do with survival. She learned songs, wordless melodies that her people sang while working, while walking, while sitting around the fire in the evening. She learned stories, though we cannot know what they were about, what characters populated her people's mythology, what explanations they had for the sun and moon and stars, for birth and death and the changing seasons. She learned to dance, to move her body in patterns that expressed joy or grief, or the simple pleasure of being alive. And she learned to appreciate beauty, to notice when a sunset was particularly spectacular, when a flower was particularly lovely, when a piece of flint had colours and patterns that made it special, worth keeping even if it wasn't useful for making tools. When Kira was 16, she had her first child, a daughter. The birth was difficult, and for a while it seemed like both mother and baby might die, but they survived, and Kira felt her world transform in that moment, felt herself become not just an individual, but a link in a chain, a connection between past and future, between her mother and her daughter, and all the generations that had come before and would come after. She had 2 more children over the next 10 years, a son and another daughter, and she watched them grow and learn and become people in their own right, with their own personalities, their own preferences, their own ways of being in the world. And then, when Kira was in her early 30s, something changed. Strangers appeared in the valley, people who looked almost like her people, but not quite. They were taller, more slender, with less prominent brow ridges and chins that jutted forward in a way that looked strange to her. They wore different clothing, carried different tools, spoke a language that sounded like noise, like the chattering of birds, incomprehensible and alien. These were Homo sapiens, the first ones to reach this part of Europe, and their arrival would change everything. At first, the 2 groups avoided each other. Kira's people kept to their traditional hunting grounds, and the strangers kept to theirs. But the valley was only so large, and resources were limited, and eventually they began to encounter each other more frequently. Sometimes there was tension, posturing, displays of aggression that stopped short of actual violence. Sometimes there was curiosity, cautious approaches, attempts at communication through gesture and expression. And sometimes, rarely but significantly, there was something else. Kira met one of them, a young man from the stranger group, at a river where both groups came to fish. They saw each other across the water, and instead of retreating, they stayed, watching each other with a mixture of wariness and interest. He was different from the men of her group, but not so different that she couldn't recognize him as human, as someone like her. Over the following weeks, they encountered each other several more times, always at the river, always keeping a safe distance, but gradually growing more comfortable with each other's presence. And then one day, he crossed the river, and she didn't run, and they stood facing each other, close enough to touch, and something passed between them, some recognition, some connection that transcended the differences in their appearance and their culture and their language. I will not tell you what happened next, because it is private, because it belongs to them, because some things should remain mysterious even in a story that is already built on speculation and imagination. But I will tell you that Kira had another child, a son, and that this son looked slightly different from her other children, and that he carried within him the genes of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that he survived and had children of his own, and that his genetic legacy spread through the population, mixing and blending until the distinction between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens became blurred, became meaningless, became simply human. Kira lived to be 42, which was old for her time, old enough to see her grandchildren, old enough to become an elder, a keeper of knowledge, someone the younger generation came to for advice and stories, and the wisdom that comes from having survived. And when she died, her people buried her with care, placing her favourite scraper near her hand, painting her face with red ochre, covering her grave with stones arranged in a pattern that meant something to them, that represented something we can never know. And then they moved on, because that is what people do, what people have always done, carrying their grief with them but continuing to live, to hunt, to gather, to raise children, to tell stories, to sing songs, to create meaning in a world that offers none except what we make ourselves. Kira never existed, except that someone like her did. Many someones, thousands of someones, Neanderthal women who lived and loved and gave birth and raised children and grew old and died, each one an individual, each one a person with her own thoughts and feelings and experiences, each one as real and as valuable as any human who has ever lived. And when we talk about Neanderthals going extinct, when we use that cold, clinical language, we are talking about the deaths of individuals like Kira, people who did not know they were part of a species that was disappearing, who did not understand that their way of life was ending, who simply lived their lives as best they could and then died, leaving behind only fragments, only traces, only the faintest echoes of their existence. And now let me tell you about Aram, a Homo sapiens man who lived at the same time, in the same region, who might have been the young man who met Kira at the river, or who might have been someone else entirely, because there were many such encounters, many such moments when two human species looked at each other and saw not an enemy, but a potential partner, a possible future, a bridge between worlds. Aram was born into a group that was constantly moving, constantly exploring, constantly pushing into new territories. His people had come from Africa, though he did not know this, didn't have the concept of continents or migration, or the deep history that had brought his ancestors to this place. He only knew that his group moved with the seasons, following the herds, seeking new hunting grounds, new sources of food, new places to shelter when the weather turned cold. He was restless by nature, always wanting to see what lay beyond the next hill, always curious about the world and its mysteries. When his group encountered the Neanderthals, Aram was fascinated rather than frightened. He studied them from a distance, noting how they moved, how they hunted, how they made, their tools. He noticed that their tools were different from his people's tools, simpler in some ways, but effective, refined through thousands of generations of use. He noticed that they seemed to prefer certain types of game, certain hunting strategies, certain places to camp. And he noticed that they were people, not animals, not monsters, but people with families and relationships and emotions he could recognize, even if he couldn't understand their language. The encounter at the river was not planned. Aram had gone there alone, seeking solitude, seeking a moment away from the constant noise and activity of his group. And there she was, a Neanderthal woman, also alone, also seeking something he couldn't name. They looked at each other, and in that moment something shifted. He saw not a member of another species, but a person, an individual, someone who was like him in the ways that mattered. And perhaps she saw the same thing in him. What happened between them was brief, a few encounters over a few weeks, and then his group moved on, following the herds north, and he never saw her again. But he thought about her sometimes, wondered what had become of her. wondered if the child she might have been carrying was his, wondered if somewhere in the world there was a being who carried both his legacy and hers, who was a bridge between two ways of being human. He never knew the answer. He lived his life, had other children with a woman from his own group, grew old and died, and was buried in a way that his people considered proper, with tools and ornaments and red ochre, in a grave that has long since been lost to time, but his genes survived, and her genes survived. And somewhere in the mixing and blending of populations, in the complex web of ancestry that connects all of us to the past, their encounter mattered. It added diversity to the gene pool. It gave future generations advantages they would not have had otherwise. It made us, in some small way, who we are. What does it mean to be human? The question has haunted philosophers and scientists for centuries, and the more we learn about our evolutionary history, the more complex the answer becomes. We used to think it was simple. Humans are Homo sapiens, the wise ones, the ones with language and art and culture and consciousness. Everything else was not human, was animal, was other. But now we know that there were many human species, many ways of being human, and the boundaries between them were not as clear as we once imagined. If Neanderthals could create art, could bury their dead, could care for the injured, could feel compassion and grief and joy, then were they not human? If Denisovans could interbreed with Homo sapiens and produce fertile offspring, if their children could survive and thrive and pass on their genes, then were they not human? If Homo erectus could use fire and make tools and spread across continents and persist for nearly 2 million years, then were they not human? Where do we draw the line? What criteria do we use to decide who counts as human and who doesn't? The traditional answer has been based on biology, on taxonomy, on the classification systems that scientists use to organize the natural world. Homo sapiens is a species, and species are defined by their ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. By this definition, Neanderthals and Denisovans might be considered subspecies of Homo sapiens rather than separate species, because they could clearly interbreed with us and produce children who were fertile and successful. But this definition is messy, complicated by the fact that speciation is a process rather than an event, that populations can be in the process of diverging without having completely separated, that the boundaries between species are often fuzzy and unclear. And perhaps the biological definition is not the right one anyway. Perhaps what makes someone human is not their DNA, but their consciousness, their capacity for thought and feeling and self-awareness. By this definition, Neanderthals were clearly human. They had brains as large as ours, possibly larger. They had the same basic brain structure, the same neural architecture that supports consciousness in Homo sapiens. They created art and ritual and culture. They cared for each other. They buried their dead. They were, in every meaningful sense, people. But if we accept this definition, then we must also accept its implications. We must accept that when Neanderthals went extinct, it was not just the loss of a species, but the loss of a people, a culture, a way of being in the world. We must accept that their extinction was a tragedy, not in the abstract sense of evolutionary loss, but in the concrete sense of individual deaths, of families torn apart, of children who died before they could grow up, of elders who died knowing that their way of life was ending. We must accept that we, Homo sapiens, played a role in that extinction, whether through direct violence or through competition for resources or through the introduction of diseases or simply through our success, our ability to outcompete them in a world that could not support both species indefinitely. And we must ask ourselves, what does this mean for how we think about intelligence, about consciousness, about the value of different minds? Because if Neanderthals were human, if they had consciousness and culture, and the capacity for suffering, then their extinction was not inevitable, not natural, not simply the way evolution works. It was a loss, a diminishment, a reduction in the diversity of ways of being human. And if we mourn that loss, If we feel that something precious was lost when the last Neanderthal died, then we must also ask ourselves what other forms of consciousness, what other ways of experiencing reality might exist in the world today, in species we consider non-human, in minds that are different from ours but no less valuable, no less worthy of existence. The question of what makes someone human is not just academic. It has practical implications for how we treat other beings, how we value different forms of life, how we think about our responsibilities to the world and its inhabitants. If we define humanity narrowly, if we say that only Homo sapiens counts, that only beings exactly like us deserve moral consideration, then we can justify almost anything. We can justify the destruction of habitats, the extinction of species, the exploitation of beings who are conscious and capable of suffering, but who happen to have different DNA, different body plans, different ways of being in the world. But if we define humanity broadly, if we say that what matters is consciousness, is the capacity for suffering and joy, is the ability to have experiences and preferences and a subjective sense of what it's like to be alive, then we must expand our circle of moral consideration. We must recognize that we are not alone in having inner lives, that we are not the only beings who matter, that the world is full of consciousness in many forms, and that each form has value, has worth, has a right to exist. The Neanderthals cannot speak for themselves. They left no written records, no explicit statements of their beliefs or values or experiences. But they left evidence, fragments, traces that suggest they were people, that they had inner lives, that they mattered. And if we honour their memory, if we acknowledge that their extinction was a loss, then we must also commit ourselves to preventing similar losses in the future, to protecting the diversity of consciousness in all its forms, to recognising that intelligence and awareness and the capacity for suffering exist in many species, in many minds, and that all of them deserve our respect and our care. In laboratories around the world, scientists are using new technologies to extract ancient DNA from bones and teeth and sediments, to sequence entire genomes from individuals who died tens of thousands of years ago, to reconstruct the genetic history of human populations with a precision that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. And with each new discovery, the story becomes more complex, more nuanced, more surprising. We now know that the interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other human species was not a rare event, but a common one, happening multiple times in multiple locations over tens of thousands of years. We know that some Homo sapiens populations have more Neanderthal DNA than others, suggesting that the mixing happened in specific places and times, that some groups had more contact with Neanderthals than others. We know that some genes from Neanderthals and Denisovans have been strongly selected for in modern populations, meaning they provided significant advantages, while other genes have been selected against, meaning they were harmful or neutral. We are beginning to understand which specific genes came from which species, what they do, how they affect our biology and our behaviour. We are beginning to reconstruct the physical appearance of Neanderthals and Denisovans with increasing accuracy, using DNA to predict skin colour, hair colour, eye colour, facial features. We are even beginning to understand their microbiomes, the bacteria and other microorganisms that lived in their guts and on their skin, which tells us about their diets, their health, their environments, and we are finding evidence of other human species, populations we didn't know existed, ghost lineages that appear in our DNA but have left no fossil record. In Africa, there are genetic signatures of at least 2 unknown human species that interbred with Homo sapiens, species that may have been as different from us as Neanderthals and Denisovans, but that lived in regions where preservation of fossils is poor, where the evidence has been lost to time and erosion and the recycling of the Earth's crust. Who were they? What were they like? We may never know, but their genes survive in modern African populations, silent witnesses to encounters that happened long ago. New technologies are also allowing us to extract DNA from sediments, from the dirt in caves where ancient humans lived, which contains traces of their genetic material even when no bones are present. This technique has revealed that many more human species used certain caves than we knew from the fossil record alone, that the overlap between different populations was greater than we imagined, that the world of 50,000 years ago was more crowded, more diverse, more complex than we ever suspected. And we are using ancient DNA to understand not just biology, but behavior, culture, social structure. By analyzing the genomes of multiple individuals from the same site, we can determine how they were related to each other, whether they were part of the same family group, whether they practiced exogamy or endogamy, whether their social structures were patrilical or matrilocal. We can track migrations, see how populations moved and mixed and separated over time. We can identify individuals who were hybrids, who had parents from different species, who were living bridges between different ways of being human. But perhaps the most exciting development is the possibility of reconstructing ancient proteins, ancient metabolisms, even ancient neural structures. By analysing the genes that code for brain development, for neurotransmitter systems, for the proteins that make up neurons and synapses, we can begin to understand how Neanderthal brains might have been different from ours, how their consciousness might have felt different, how their experience of reality might have been unique. We cannot know for certain. We cannot resurrect a Neanderthal and ask them what it's like to be them. But we can make educated guesses, can build models, can use our understanding of neuroscience and genetics to imagine what their inner lives might have been like. And some researchers are going even further, proposing that we could, in theory, use genetic engineering to recreate Neanderthals, to take Homo sapiens DNA and edit it to match the Neanderthal genome, to implant it in a human egg and bring a Neanderthal child into the world. This is, of course, deeply controversial, raising profound ethical questions about consent and identity, and the rights of beings who would be created solely for scientific purposes. But the fact that it's even possible that we have the technology to potentially bring back an extinct human species forces us to confront questions we've never had to ask before. Would a recreated Neanderthal be human? Would they have rights? Would they be a person or a research subject? Would it be ethical to create them, knowing they would be alone, the only one of their kind, living in a world that is not their world, among people who are like them but not quite like them? These are not abstract questions. They are questions we may have to answer in our lifetimes, as technology continues to advance, as our ability to manipulate genes and create life becomes more sophisticated. And how we answer them will say a lot about who we are, about what we value, about whether we have learned anything from the extinction of the Neanderthals and Denisovans and all the other human species that once shared the world with us. Because the story of 280,000 years ago is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. It is about how we think about diversity, about difference, about the value of other minds and other ways of being. It is about whether we can learn to coexist with beings who are different from us, whether we can recognize their humanity even when they don't look like us, don't think like us, don't share our culture or our language or our way of life. It is about whether we can expand our circle of compassion to include not just our own species, but all conscious beings, all minds that can suffer and feel joy and have experiences that matter to them. The Neanderthals are gone, the Denisovans are gone, Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis and all the other human species that once walked the earth are gone, but their legacy remains in our genes, in our consciousness, in the very fact of our existence. We are here because they were there. We carry them within us. And perhaps, in honouring their memory, in acknowledging that their extinction was a loss, we can commit ourselves to ensuring that no other conscious beings suffer the same fate, that the diversity of mind and consciousness in the world is protected and celebrated rather than destroyed. As you read these words, as you sit in whatever place you're sitting, in whatever time you're reading this, take a moment to feel your body, to notice your breath, to become aware of the fact that you are alive, that you're conscious, that you are a being with an inner life, with thoughts and feelings and experiences that are uniquely yours. And then consider this. The capacity for that awareness, for that consciousness, is not something that emerged with Homo sapiens. It is something we inherited from ancestors who were human in different ways, who had different bodies and different brains, but who were conscious nonetheless, who had inner lives as rich and complex as yours, who felt joy and sorrow and fear and love and all the emotions that make life worth living. You are not just Homo sapiens. You're the inheritor of a legacy that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, that includes multiple human species, that encompasses a diversity of ways of being human that we're only beginning to understand. In your DNA, you carry fragments of Neanderthals, of Denisovans, of other human species we haven't even named yet. In your consciousness, you carry the capacity for compassion and creativity and symbolic thought that existed long before our species emerged. In your very existence, you carry the proof that different human species could meet and mix and create something new, something that combined the strengths of both, something that was more than the sum of its parts. And this should change how you think about yourself, about your place in the world, about your relationship to other beings. Because if you are not purely Homo sapiens, if you are a hybrid, a mixture, a combination of multiple human lineages, then the boundaries between self and other, between us and them, between human and non-human, are not as clear as you might have thought. You're connected to the past in ways that are intimate and profound. You're connected to other species, other minds, other ways of being. You are part of a web of life that extends across time and space, that includes beings who are gone but not forgotten, who are extinct but not erased, who live on in you and in everyone who carries their genes. And if you carry the legacy of extinct human species, if you honor their memory, if you acknowledge that their loss was a tragedy, then you must also ask yourself, what am I doing to prevent similar tragedies in the future? What am I doing to protect the diversity of consciousness in the world? What am I doing to ensure that other species, other minds, other ways of being are valued and preserved rather than destroyed? These are not easy questions. They require us to change how we live, how we consume, how we interact with the world. They require us to recognize that we are not the only beings who matter, that we are not the pinnacle of evolution, that we are not separate from nature but part of it, connected to all other living things through bonds of kinship and shared history and mutual dependence. They require us to expand our circle of compassion, to see value in beings who are different from us, to recognize that consciousness exists in many forms and that all of them deserve respect. The Neanderthals cannot speak for themselves, but we can speak for them. We can tell their story. We can honor their memory. We can acknowledge that they were people, that they mattered, that their extinction was a loss. And in doing so, we can commit ourselves to ensuring that the diversity of consciousness in the world is protected, that no other species suffers the same fate, that the web of life remains rich and complex and full of different ways of being. This is not just about the past, it is about the future. It is about what kind of world we want to create, what kind of legacy we want to leave, what kind of ancestors we want to be for the generations that will come after us. Because just as we are the inheritors of a legacy from the past, we are also the creators of a legacy for the future. What we do now, how we treat other beings, how we value diversity and consciousness and the richness of life in all its forms, will determine what kind of world our descendants inherit, what stories they tell about us, whether they honor our memory or mourn our failures. The fires of the Neanderthals have gone out. The voices of the Denisovans have fallen silent. The footsteps of Homo erectus have faded into dust. But the story continues. It continues in us, in our genes, in our consciousness, in our capacity to remember and to honor and to learn from the past. It continues in every act of compassion, every moment of creativity, every time we choose to value diversity rather than destroy it, to protect consciousness rather than extinguish it, to recognize the humanity in beings who are different from us. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Perhaps the story of 280,000 years ago, the story of multiple human species sharing the world, competing and cooperating and mixing and creating something new, is not just a story about the past, but a template for the future. Perhaps it teaches us that diversity is strength, that different ways of being can coexist and even enhance each other, that the boundaries between us and them are not as rigid as we imagine, that consciousness in all its forms is precious and worthy of protection. The last Neanderthal died alone, or perhaps surrounded by Homo sapiens who did not understand that they were witnessing the end of a species, the extinction of a way of being human that would never exist again. But we understand, we know what was lost, and in that knowledge lies both a burden and an opportunity. The burden of remembering, of honouring, of acknowledging the tragedy of extinction. And the opportunity to do better, to learn from the past, to create a future where diversity is celebrated, where different minds and different ways of being are valued, where consciousness in all its forms is protected and preserved. You're here because they were there. You carry their legacy in your genes, in your consciousness, in the very fact of your existence. And what you do with that legacy, how you honour it, how you use it to shape the future, is up to you. The story is not over. It continues in you, in every choice you make, in every action you take, in every moment when you choose compassion over cruelty, diversity over uniformity, life over extinction. The fires may have gone out, but the story continues, and you are part of that story. You are the living answer to a question that was asked 280,000 years ago, when different human species looked at each other across a valley or a river or a cave entrance and wondered, are you like me? Can we coexist? Can we create something new together? The answer, written in your DNA, carried forward through hundreds of generations, is yes. Yes, we are like each other. Yes, we can coexist. Yes, we can create something new, something that combines the best of all of us, something that honours the diversity of consciousness and the richness of life in all its forms. And in that answer lies hope. Hope that we can learn from the past. Hope that we can do better in the future. Hope that the story of humanity, in all its diversity and complexity and wonder, will continue for generations to come, carried forward by beings who remember where they came from, and who honour the legacy of all the human species that came before. Sleep now, if you can. But let the story linger. Let it settle into your bones, into your blood, into the deepest parts of your being. Because you are part of that story. You are the inheritor of a legacy that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. You are the carrier of genes from multiple human species. You are the living proof that different ways of being human can meet and mix and create something new. And in that inheritance lies both a burden and a gift. The burden of remembering, of honouring, of acknowledging what was lost. And the gift of consciousness, of creativity, of the capacity to imagine a better future and to work toward making it real. The Neanderthals are gone, but they live on in you. The Denisovans are gone, but they live on in you. All the human species that once walked the earth, all the different ways of being human, all the diverse minds and consciousnesses that experienced reality in their own unique ways, they are gone, but they live on in you. And what you do with that legacy, how you honour it, how you use it to shape the world, is the story that is still being written, the story that will be told by future generations. The story that will determine whether the extinction of the Neanderthals and Denisovans was the end of human diversity, or just a chapter in a longer story, a story that continues, that evolves, that grows richer and more complex with each passing generation. You are here because they were there, and they are here because you remember them, and in that remembering, in that honouring, in that acknowledgement of what was lost and what was gained lies the essence of what it means to be human. Not just Homo sapiens, but human in the deepest sense. Conscious, creative, capable of learning from the past and imagining a better future. Forever seeking to understand our place in the vast sweep of time and to honour the legacy of all those who came before. The story continues, and you are part of it. And that perhaps is the greatest truth of all.